Good afternoon. Welcome to Jumpstart's monthly expert-led webinar today with Claire Coyne on securing space for business growth. I'm Lauren Smith-Petta. I serve as Jumpstart's Director of Education. Jumpstart offers this webinar series on a different topic every month, along with a variety of other educational programs and events. I invite you to visit jumpstartinc.org/smallbiz to explore our services. So before I introduce our presenter today, a few obligatory housekeeping items. This presentation session will be 60 to 90 minutes. Necessary remaining time will be set aside for the Q&A portion. In your toolbar at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see an important communication tool at your disposal today, the chat. Claire may ask you to respond to questions throughout, so please place your comments there. You're also welcome to introduce yourselves at any time in the chat so she knows who's in the room. You can also see the Q&A, which is a great place to put your questions as they occur to you. If it's time sensitive, I will interrupt Claire or she will interrupt herself to answer them. If they can wait until the Q&A, we'll do that. At the end of today's session and in a follow-up email, you'll receive a brief survey. We appreciate your feedback. It allows us to continue to bring in experts to teach these valuable lessons for free. All right, without further ado, allow me to introduce our presenter today. Claire Coyne is a director in the Cleveland office of commercial real estate services firm Newmark. With past experience ranging from IT systems audits for financial services, insurance, manufacturing, and health services clients, to experience in supply chain operations, she currently serves on the Northern Ohio office and industrial investment and leasing team. So we've got the right person to talk to us about moving into space for your business. We're lucky to have her to share her expertise today. Claire, welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to chat with you all today. So as Lauren mentioned, please feel free to add in questions into the question and answer box. I would love to answer any questions as they go through, because as you'll learn, and many of you may know this, real estate is a whole bunch of just acronyms and all around jargon. So there's a lot of letters and numbers and things that does not need to be difficult that are made difficult in its own language. So if there's anything throughout the presentation, whether it's an explanation as to what I'm saying or an explanation as to go further into depth, please let me know. So let's see, I'll make sure this goes perfect. Sorry, that picture is very big. I don't know why our slide deck has pictures this large, but as Lauren mentioned, I'm Claire Coyne. I used to be in consulting at KPMG. I worked there for a few years right after college, primarily in the financial sector, working in the IT group and the supply chain group. I did consulting in Cleveland and Columbus, and while I loved it, was ready for a change about 3 years ago. So 3 years ago, I became licensed as a real estate salesperson, primarily focusing on commercial real estate. So we cover anything pretty much but houses. So we are licensed legally as a salesperson in the state of Ohio to do residential and commercial. People tend to focus on one or the other, and commercial includes big, huge industrial buildings, office buildings, small or large, retail, again, small or large, flex properties, which is a combination of office, industrial, or retail and office. So anything with flex is a combination of two of the types of properties. And then we do investment sales and then multifamily. So we are licensed in everything. We're well-versed in everything. And this this presentation today is primarily on the commercial side of things. And I'll also go into depth the difference between a residential salesperson or broker and a commercial salesperson or broker. So I work for Newmark. We are across all of North America, and we now are in Europe, which is very exciting. We have a London office. So even if I don't know something within the Cleveland office, we have many colleagues who are experts in that field. And then we also are able to recommend out-of-state folks. So we are just licensed for the state of Ohio, and most people are just licensed for the state that they live in, but they have the ability to recommend their colleagues elsewhere to give advice, services, etc. So this is our agenda for today. We will go through the process for securing a space. Then we'll answer some questions. So where can I search for a commercial space? What is the best place to do it? And then there's a lot of noise. People try to advertise other websites that are just not helpful or not up to date. So we'll go through all of that. who can be a resource. So besides a salesperson, who in the real estate process and search for a space can be a resource to you, and people that I think are very necessary in this space. Common terms that landlords or owners will just throw out thinking that people know them. They're not common. It took me about a year to fully understand the dictionary of real estate terms. So we'll go through the most common terms. We'll do the calculation for base rent because a lot of landlords calculate it or refer to it as monthly rent versus, annual rent versus a base rent. And then we'll go through any questions. Okay, the process for securing a space. Step number one for you all would be to determine your need. And I know that sounds obvious. However, there are so many times where someone walks in and they either have a massive range of square feet, or they're not quite sure what they would need in this space, or they're not quite sure the term. So I invite everybody to really, really research the specific items that you need. If you are a restaurant, how big of a kitchen do you need? What types of things will you be cooking within your kitchen? We just had this example come through for a retail space for about a 2,000 to 3,000 square foot cafe. And they walked in thinking that the hood that they had needed to be a certain size. Come to find out later on, while we're in the lease process, that the hood needed to be way larger and it was going to be a $50,000 investment. So we had to kind of go back to square one. So I very much recommend you figure out exactly what you need. If it's office space, how many people do you have? Do you have 4 people? Do they each need their own office? There's recommendations for a certain number of square foot per person when it comes to an office space, and that's about 100 to 200 square feet. So that is as much research as you could possibly do is going to be extremely helpful. The research that I would recommend is square footage, the exact needs within your square footage. So again, if it's retail, or do you have a front office or front shop and a back office? If it is a restaurant, is it a sit-down restaurant? Are you just having people walk up to your counter? That's huge. And then establishing your location. So this can be a range of locations. But it is helpful when you have a focus on a certain location because again, you can kind of wipe out the noise. A lot of people will send you information once they know that you're in the market of spaces that could work and could be a great space, but it's not in the right location. So that's an easy thing to just narrow down. Another thing that's super, super important is to create a budget, because one of the first questions that you're going to be asked is how much can you pay in rent? And that is, of course, not your only expense that you have. So, start from the top. You have all of your employees. How much can you afford for your space? How much can you afford for an investment into the space, etc. And then establish your timing. So what is your timing? Do you need to be in tomorrow? Do you need to be in 6 months? And then also within that timing is how much time do you need to set up your space? If it's an office, a lot of the times you can just walk in because the space is fully ready. If it is a cafe, if it is a spa, a bakery, anything retail facing, you typically need to give yourself 3 to 4 months because a build out will take approximately 2 to 3 months. You need to account for the permitting. You need to account for training, things like that. So once you have your timing, your budget, and your location and everything that you need in your space, you're ready to tour. So you've now narrowed down all of your options. And within those options, I would tour as many as possible, as many as your calendar allows you to tour. So if you can fit in 3 or 4 in a day, I'd go for it. And as I'm looking and touring, take pictures, take a ton of notes, because believe me when I say that once you get onto that second or third tour location, everything starts to just meld together. So this is also part of your research too, to tour all of these options. Once you're done touring, I would narrow it down to 2 or 3. I think it's always easier if you have your top few for a couple of reasons. One, mentally, it's just easier for you to keep track of. And typically there's not going to be 5 or 6 that work exactly for what you need. So think of this very similarly as touring a house. When you're touring a commercial space, there are things that you absolutely cannot go without and compromise on. And then there's other things that are okay if you compromise. So once you've narrowed it down to those 2 to 3 options, this is your next step for a proposal or a letter of intent. And a letter of intent and proposal are essentially the exact same thing. It's just 2 different words for it. And a lot of people in the commercial space refer to it as an LOI. So your proposal or letter of intent stage, and we'll go through more specifically what all of these look like. So if there's a question on these, later in the slide deck, I have examples of what these look like and stuff like that. So 2 to 3 options allows you to, for lack of a better word, pit a couple different options against each other, right? You're trying to get the best bang for your buck. You're also trying to be treated the best way possible. And you want the landlord to do the most for you before you move into this space. So if you've narrowed it down to 2 to 3 options, you're then able to compare for yourself, but you're also able to mention to a different landlord, hey, you know what, I have a better offer at this other space. I like your space, but space A is offering a better option than your space currently. So this brings us to the proposal letter of intent. So you can either ask the landlord for a proposal to be given to you. And at this point, I would have your specific requests in mind. So again, how long of a term are you asking for? Do you just want a year to year? Are you looking for a 3-year? Are you looking for a 5-year, etc.? Then if you have a broker or a salesperson who's representing you, they will send a request for proposal, RFP, again with the language, it's not, I don't know why there's so many acronyms, but a request for proposal where then the landlord responds to the questions that you are posing to them. And again, do not worry, we will go through an LOI and an RFP later in the slide deck. In this stage, the negotiating will go back and forth. Typically, the document turns twice. Maybe 3 times, but the landlord will respond, then you'll redline back and forth. Hopefully this doesn't take more than a couple weeks. It shouldn't take more than a couple weeks, but that's kind of the goal, is for the timing of an LOI or proposal stage is maybe 2 to 3 weeks. Then you're moving on to the lease. So you've picked your building, you've decided on the business terms. Now, all of the business terms are discussed within a proposal and an LOI, or they should be. I would highly recommend not moving directly to a lease if at all possible. Even if it's simple, the proposal can only have 5 or 6 bullet points, but people use people use a proposal to determine the lease for the space. Now, the lease is filled with a ton of legal terminology. If you take nothing else from this entire presentation, I would highly, highly recommend getting a lawyer and specifically a real estate lawyer, if at all possible, to look at the lease. I know Jumpstart has some ability and recommendations for a lawyer. I do as well. There are so many instances where we are called in to help after a lease has been signed because they thought the landlord or the owner was going to do XYZ, and they're not. And the landlord or the owner will refer back to the lease and say, well, technically, I don't have to do XYZ. It's extremely annoying. It's not good business practice, but unfortunately, it happens all the time. So the business terms, that's easy. Anybody can figure out the business terms. The lease, I would highly recommend a lawyer looking at. And we do that even as if we are representing a tenant or a landlord, we always refer them to a lawyer to go through every single line for the lease, just to see any way that the landlord may not be able to accommodate you. And by the way, it's, nothing's legal until it's signed. So if there's something, you can still walk away if you haven't signed the lease yet. So that's huge. I think as the person looking for the space, you want to make sure you ensure a full understanding of business terms. But unless you're a trained lawyer, it's very difficult to understand the full legal terms. So that would be my biggest takeaway from this entire thing, is to loop in a lawyer right before the end of it. Okay, so now that we've gone over the overall process, I'm going to stop for a couple seconds. Are there any questions on the basic process? We'll go more into depth, but I do want to be able to cover any questions. I personally don't see any in the question and answer box, but Lauren, please correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm missing something.
Not right now.
Okay. All right, I'll keep going, but interrupt me if anything comes through. Okay, so where should I serve? Cleveland is a LoopNet market. So LoopNet is the commercial side of a Realtor.com, a Zillow, Redfin for residential. So we are a LoopNet market, meaning that people who have spaces, owners or brokers who are representing the owners, are posting their availability, whether it's lease or sale, onto LoopNet. And you'll find the most up-to-date information on LoopNet from both the broker and the salesperson. and LoopNet itself. We have a very strong LoopNet market of researchers who are going through consistently pretty much every single day to make sure that the information that is posted is correct. So LoopNet allows a couple things. You can search for commercial real estate listings for lease or for sale. You can monitor your favorite properties. So similar to a realtor.com or a Zillow, you can heart them and you can follow along if anything changes. You can connect instantly with the broker that is representing the property. So you can message them right on the app. And it also helps to narrow down your search because there are filters that you can go through and filter by location, by square footage, by type of property. So the things that we talked about in that very first step, you can filter through LoopNet. Unfortunately, this picture right here advertises Miami, Florida. I was really hoping it would say Cleveland, Ohio, but it does say Miami, Florida. So this is just their stock photo that they use. But I did want to note that there are a lot of other websites that are out there. Crexy, Showcase, Commercial Cafe, Property Shark. In some other markets outside of Cleveland, these are the options to go to. For whatever reason, LoopNet is the strongest option and the most up to date. I don't think it's a bad thing to take a look at Crexy, Showcase, Commercial Cafe, or Property Shark, but I would keep in mind that if you don't see it on LoopNet, but you see it on one of these other websites, LoopNet is 9 times out of 10 the most updated. So if it's showing as available on these 4 other websites, but it's not showing available on LoopNet, likely say that it's not available currently. So the multiple listing sites, MLS sites, those are the 4 main ones. If they're smaller and I didn't even put them on here, I would just completely avoid them. Other websites, separate from the multiple listing sites, are the brokerage websites. And this is a great secondary option. So brokerage websites would be, for instance, I work at Newmark. So Newmark has all of our properties that we represent on our website. It offers additional building information a lot of the times. It offers additional contact information. So if that main contact on LoopNet doesn't seem to be getting back to you, they may offer secondary or tertiary contacts for that property. So I think it's a great secondary option. A lot of times on LoopNet, it'll actually take you to the brokerage websites. So other examples besides Newmark would be Cresco, Cushman, JLL, CBRE. So those are other commercial brokerage firms within Cleveland. Okay, so again, I'll stop just to make sure for the where to find the commercial space. Any questions so far? Okay. So who can be a resource? Like I mentioned, a lawyer is considered a must-have, and we recommend every single one of our clients to have a lawyer look over the lease. I understand that lawyers charge monthly. It can be a little bit more expensive. So if nothing else, they should look over the lease before you have signed anything, because that lease document is considered binding. So whatever you have signed to will then be what you're responsible for. So like I mentioned before, legal terminology is much different than business terms. If possible, I would recommend hiring or consulting with a real estate lawyer. While any lawyer can be fantastic, a real estate lawyer will know the ins and outs of all of the legal terminology. An example of that would be business days versus days. So a lot of the times people will try to slide in the business days versus days, which can benefit or hinder either side. But business days would just be, Monday through Friday. So if it's 10 business days from the current day, the only days that are counted in that example are Monday through Friday. If you say days, then Monday through Sunday, so that Saturday and Sunday is counted. So it goes by a lot faster. So if you have to give a notice for something, you always want business days on your side, because that means you get a little bit longer because the weekends do not count. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Let's see, please comment on sources of attorney referrals and also sources of affordable legal services. Absolutely. So we have a laundry list of these folks who can help. So I have stuff, and I believe I might let Lauren comment on this as well, because I believe Jumpstart also has sources.
Sorry, I was fumbling for my mute button. I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat. We refer to the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association and the lawyer referral service so that you can find an attorney who is totally appropriate for your needs. So I'll put that in the chat so that I would argue that is not free, but it is more affordable than others.
Yes. And I know that there's gonna be some follow-up at the end of it too, so I'm happy to give additional context as well. And I can pass along to Jumpstart to pass along to everybody else. Great, that is a great question, because that happens a lot and it's totally understandable because a lot of the times it seems an extra cost, but it is such an important extra cost and there are ways to do it affordably. And it doesn't have to be, you know, every single turn of the lease. It just has to be before you sign any legal document. Another person just wrote, Cleveland CDCs are sometimes helpful in source of advice for neighborhood retail locations. Yes, absolutely. That's fantastic. So another person to consult would be a real estate salesperson or broker. So it's certainly not considered a must-have by any means. They can help facilitate touring, business terms, the proposal, and the lease, and they can be a great resource for additional contacts. One important thing to note is there is a difference between a residential and then a commercial salesperson or broker. Legally, they're licensed. Everyone is licensed in the state of Ohio to do the same thing. So I am legally able to sell or buy a house on behalf of somebody, help them on behalf of somebody else, even though my main role is in the commercial space. However, I don't know that much about the residential market other than what I hear from other people who are in that space. So I do think if it's all possible, a commercial salesperson or broker is great for retail spaces, office spaces, anything that's not residential. It is 99% out of the time not the tenant's responsibility to pay for the brokerage fee. It's actually the landlord side. So there are many cases where you could hire someone like me and it's coming out of the landlord bill, not yours, to pay a salesperson or a broker in this case. Let's see. Okay, I just got a note. I'm a business owner that already signed a binding lease. I had a financial setback and I need a lawyer at a lower cost. My area legal aid is able to help me. Any advice? Fantastic. That's an awesome piece of advice. Okay, any questions about lawyer, real estate person? And then there's also, I think someone just came in. Let's see. Oh, not able. Excuse me. Sorry. Oh no. Okay, gotcha. So my area legal aid is not able to help me. Any advice? Yes. Okay. So, like it was mentioned before, there is a list of folks that Jumpstart can recommend. I can also recommend a lot of real estate lawyers who do things pro bono. So there's usually a cap on the hours, but they either do it pro bono or for a very, very low cost overall. So yes, I am absolutely able to help with that specific situation, Monica, and I would ask maybe we connect separately on that because I can also see if there's any business terms that I'm able to help with as well. Okay. All right, so any questions, lawyer, real estate person? Okay, so Monica, yes, I can list them here. Let me just finish the presentation and then I'm happy to type them out in the chat. And then the going rate for a real estate attorney, it very, very much differs. So they charge hourly. It can be anywhere from, you know, on the low end, $50 per hour to on the high end, which I would not recommend, $1,200 or $1,300 an hour. So that is not my recommendation at all, but there's always a happy medium in the lawyer space, whether it is through Jumpstart's recommendations, the folks that I have. And it's also really good with a lawyer to set expectations on your budget as well. Because as much as I would recommend lawyers, and I think they're fantastic, they do charge by like every 15 minutes. So it's always good to set expectations. And I do that now in my setting when I'm helping a tenant rep. And I will say, I just need you to review this lease right here. We're not looking for anything crazy, but please keep in mind the following things because they're important to the tenant. So if the tenant is really worried about a certain section of the lease, I will have the lawyer look through that section, but I always have the expectation with them prior to. Okay, all these are all great questions. Anything else? Okay, so I'm going to jump to the next other resources. So interior design, architecture, there's a lot of folks who are just starting that will do this for basically to build their portfolio. So we work with a lot of people who are looking to build their portfolio, or they're specifically looking to work with women-owned businesses or minority-owned businesses, and they would love to assist. So interior design, if you're looking to build out your bakery or cafe, or let's say doggy daycare, they can offer some great and useful tips. I don't think that this is a must-have by any means. I would say that this is an extra expenditure, the interior design architecture, especially because a lot of the spaces that you could be looking at are very much close to being ready to go. And that is ideal, right? I mean, there are some spaces you walk in and need a ton of work, and that would not be in your budget, so that would be knocked off the list pretty much immediately. So I would say that interior design, architecture, that would be an extra expenditure that if you have the budget for, great. I do not think that is necessary at all. Okay. So common terms, I will go through this. I'm assuming that there's gonna be a lot of questions on the common terms, which is completely understandable. So I will try. I've got the Q&A open on the right side. So if you see me looking to my right, you'll know why. So please send all of your questions as we're going through these common terms. So a right for proposal, an RFP, is the bare bones of a proposal. So this is a document that's requesting the business terms from the opposite side, and you'll redline back and forth, and I'll show you this example right here. This is a request for proposal. Now, this is our draft that we use, so obviously things like name and address are not filled in. This is just our example. So with a request for a proposal, there is a landlord, or if you're buying a building, an owner response. And you'll go back and forth with this. So you'll confirm location, and this is just the first page. This is usually a couple pages, and I'm more than happy to assist anybody if they have any questions with the request for a proposal. So you confirm your location, the use, the specific premises. So in this case, this exact example is office, but this could be changed to any type of property type. So the tenant or the buyer needs approximately, let's call it 2,500 square feet of retail, and reserves the right to adjust the square footage by 25%. Sometimes that comes into play, sometimes that doesn't. If you've walked into a space that this is what is available, that's 2,613 square feet, then that is exactly what it is, and obviously you couldn't adjust the square footage. So you put your landlord in there, then you'll put, your term, for instance, that you're requesting a 1-year term, or you're requesting a 5-year term. So this is an opportunity for the landlord or the owner of the building to respond to your request. So this is, like I said, bare bones, and it is to get a response out of the landlord. So maybe you're trying to compare two properties, and you don't really know if you'd prefer a 1, a 3, a 5-year term. And so you add that in, that you're open to a 1, a 3, or a 5-year term, and you'll let the landlord respond. So this is a great option if there's a couple things that are outstanding and you want them to give you the answer, as opposed to you as the tenant having to come up with it. So a proposal is a direct request of business terms. So until signed, this is a non-binding agreement, and it's focused simply on business terms. So like we mentioned before, business terms versus all the legal wording, this is simply business terms. And then you can redline back and forth. So this is an example of a proposal. So the this is a real example of a proposal. So I did redact any of the specific client information. That's why you see some of this black right here. So in this case, the premises, through this redaction says, let's say 2,500 square feet, and the tenant will be taking the space as is. The commencement date shall be as soon as possible based on a mutually agreed upon date. So in this case, these folks wanted to move in I believe it was like no later than February 1st. So they agreed on actually this past Monday to move in. So the term shall be 5 years, $14 per square foot. So this is the rental rate, and do not worry, we will go through. This is one of my common terms, is the triple net. So with annual increases. So this entire proposal is sent then to the landlord or the owner for them to respond to. So they can redline it, but you are telling them exactly what you want. And letting them respond to you with any red lines that they may have. Now, these proposals are a lot more in-depth than I think is necessary. These are the examples that I had closest by, but I think the most important things that are to be included in a proposal, and I would suggest, if at all possible, to write these down, would be your tenant name, your term, so how long of a lease you want. If you're buying the building, term is not needed. The rental rate, and we'll go more in depth on the rental rate, but this is just like the things that you should include. Any tenant improvements that you would want in the space. So the landlord is in charge of. And then alternatively, any tenant improvements in the space that you are going to do. So if it were me, I would ask the landlord to do as much as humanly possible and let them say no, but some people prefer to say that they'll do a certain thing and then the landlord will do a certain thing. An example of this would be if you're doing a restaurant and with the kitchen, you will bring in the kitchen equipment and you would want to pay for that, because at the end of a lease, that kitchen equipment then stays yours, as opposed to having the landlord buy it, because at the end of the term, it is now the landlord's property. So that's just an example. Additionally, any renewal requests. So at the end, if let's say you have a 3-year term and you want the option at the end of that 3 years to renew for an additional 3 years, I think that's an important thing to add as well. Anonymous attendee, awesome. There's the Akron Law School Seed Clinic has offered 6 to 8 hours of attorney time for $300. That's fantastic. Great option.
Claire, I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
So obviously we have all of these online resources for contracts and access to attorneys that are more affordable.
Yeah.
I know you're not an attorney. I don't want to put a bunch of questions on you that are not really your problem.
Yeah.
But do you find that that's an effective resource?
An attorney?
Online, using
online.
resources like Law Depot and LegalZoom and all of these more affordable resources for contracts and legal assistance?
I think it's a fantastic option, because I think something is better than nothing. I think that, like we've mentioned before, that there's so many times people sign the dotted line on a lease and not actually realize what they're signing, which it happens to anybody. I wouldn't understand if I didn't have someone else look at it or learn line by line every single last legal piece of information. So I think that anything is better than nothing. And yes, as long as you are able to use that online resource in direct comparison to the lease, I think it's a fantastic option.
Thank you.
Okay, so like I mentioned before, but just want to reiterate, a letter of intent is the same as a proposal in pretty much any and all cases, and it can be used interchangeably. So if someone says letter of intent, it's essentially the same as a proposal. Okay, so we went through these 2 examples. No open questions as of right now. Okay, so now we're going to get into the type of leases. So again, if you're buying a building, this isn't specific to you. I will say in some capacity, buying a building is a lot less real estate jargon than in the lease term. So you're in a little bit of a benefit there. So please keep in mind that every single landlord, for whatever reason, has a slightly different definition of the types of leases. It's extremely annoying, even for someone who this is my full profession. So when we go through this, please consider asking any questions that pop into your mind, but also this is a basic framework. And then this is a great way to really ask your landlord or owner more information specific to the lease. So the first type of lease, and the one that you all will most likely see the most, is a triple net lease. And the reason I say that is a triple net lease is mainly specific to warehouses, but that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for your use. Office, retail are primarily triple net leases. A doggy daycare space, which would kind of be in the retail sector, a bakery. I'm trying to think of other things that we've chatted about with the small businesses at Jumpstart. But so any retail overarching is typically triple net lease. Offices can also be triple net lease, but a lot of the times you'll see the next form of lease that we'll talk about later is modified gross. So a triple net lease, the verbiage is triple net, but it's denoted as 3 capital N's when written out in a proposal, an RFP, an email going back and forth. The 3 N's stand for taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance expenses. So taxes, real estate taxes. So if you're in a full building, it is the real estate taxes for the entire building. If you're in part of a building, the real estate taxes are your portion of the building. So let's say you're in 50% of the building, then the real estate taxes are 50%. Your share is 50% of the real estate taxes. The next N stands for insurance. So that is building insurance. So that's the exact same formula. If you're in the entire space, then your insurance is for the entire space, the entire building. If you're in half of the building, then your insurance cost to you as the tenant is your pro rata share. So in this case, it'd be 50%. So if your insurance, I'll make up a number, is $100 a month, and you're in 50%, you're paying $50 a month. And then the third N stands for common area maintenance expenses, otherwise denoted as capital CAM. So we'll jump to the right side where I do have the common area maintenance expenses typed out. So the examples of that is landscaping, snow plow. If it's a multi-tenant building, meaning there's multiple tenants in a building, then it is, let's say, cleaning for the common area expenses. Property manager, so a management team, so property manager or a facilities manager. So these should be direct pass-through charges, meaning that there's not an upcharge. The landlord's not making money on charging you for your share of it. So it should be the landscaping bill comes right through to you as the tenant. And again, if there's 2 tenants in a building and you're each splitting 50-50, then you would pay half of the landscaping bill or half of the snowplow bill. Again, if you're, it's 25%, you're in a fourth of the space and someone else is in 3/4 of the space, it should be your pro rata share of the space. Great question. Is the insurance policy written under the tenant or the owner? So in this case, the triple net, the second N is the building insurance. So it's written under the owner, the person that owns the building. Separately, and very commonly, typically the tenant has to have their own insurance. And that's separate, that's your own cost. Great question. So triple net is your base rent plus your triple net expenses plus your utilities, and then anything else specific to the space that you choose to do, which is most commonly janitorial. So some people choose to have their space cleaned 5 nights a week or 7 nights a week because they're a restaurant and it needs to be. Others choose to have it a couple nights a week because that's all that's needed in the space. Okay, so any questions as it relates to a triple net lease or the common area maintenance expenses? That insurance one was a great one. So if there's a claim for the insurance, who receives a reimbursement? Excellent question. It depends. So it essentially depends on who has to do the work. So as an extreme example, let's say a snowplow runs into the side of the building and then there's like a brick falling off of it or something. If the landlord, and this is all would be written in your lease, if the landlord is in charge of fixing the snowplow that ran into your building, then they would receive the claim. If you're in charge of it, then you should receive the claim. And that is a lot. It's a very good question because this could be buried deep into a lease. So that's a super, super important thing to work out with the landlord or the owner of the building is who is in charge of what. Typically, with a triple net lease, the landlord should be in charge of anything structural. So that includes the roof and the wall. So if there's a massive roof leak, that should be on the landlord. There are some landlords though that say it's a triple net lease, the tenant is in charge of everything. So in your question with the insurance, that would mean that you're in charge of fixing it and that you're also in charge, or you get the policy back. Great question. Anything else?
Claire, I actually have a question too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I had a client with an experience relating to common area maintenance, which was that there was no mention of who cared for the HVAC in the building as a result of, or it was just specifically mentioned the tenant was the one responsible for the HVAC.
Sure.
That kind of thing, if it is detected by a lawyer upon review of the contract, is it negotiable?
Yes and no. So the first and foremost, the landlord needs to give you the space in good working order. So that includes good HVAC. Now it just depends. If it's a routine maintenance thing that typically falls on the tenant, if the entire system just breaks, that is primarily negotiable at the beginning, but it should really be on the landlord to fix it in a retail type space. In a warehouse, it's a little bit different, but in a retail type space where, you have clients walking in or you have guests walking in, that should really be on the landlord, but all of that needs to be established at the beginning. And as a tenant or someone who's taking the space, you have the complete right to have the HVAC system inspected or have other systems inspected, because if it's your responsibility moving forward, you don't want to take over a space where the HVAC system is likely to completely break in a year or two, because that is a massive expense that could be coming your way.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Anything else? I personally think the triple net expenses is the most relevant to everybody on this call. So if there's any questions at all, please let me know. Okay. As always, though, continue to interrupt if there's anything else. Okay, so another type of lease is a modified gross lease, where the base rent includes everything except for the utilities. So what we mentioned before, the taxes, the insurance, CAM, janitorial, as an example, would be included in your base rent except for your utilities. So you're paying for water, or you're paying for, electricity, or you're paying for electricity and water. So this type of lease seems fantastic because it's all wrapped in one, but please note that the base rent is typically then higher than the base rent of a triple net lease. Because if you look right here at this formula, the total cost equals base rent plus triple net expenses. Typically, the base rent plus triple net expenses would be a comparable number to a modified gross lease because it's all wrapped in one. Personally, I think for accounting purposes, it's way easier for the tenant to be in a modified gross lease as compared to a triple net lease. However, it's easier for the landlord to be in a triple net lease typically than it is for a modified gross lease. So this we usually see in an office building or either singular or a multi-tenant office building. So this, I don't know how relevant it is, so I didn't feel the need to go more in depth. And I will say it's a little bit easier just in general because it's all under one base rent number. And then you pay for your utilities, and the utilities typically are direct pass through, or it's your pro rata share of the bill per month as it relates to your space. And then they true it up at the end of the year. And then a gross lease is the best kind of lease because it includes everything in your base rent. That is very, very rare to ever find everything included in your base rent. Any questions before we go to the next slide on any type of lease? These are the three main types. Okay, the one thing I do want to know, I just thought of this, I probably should have added it in, but triple net lease, 3 ends, it includes taxes, insurance, and your common area maintenance. If you ever see a double net lease, ask about it because they're removing one of taxes, insurance, or common area maintenance expenses and putting it into the base rent. It's great. You're not getting swindled or anything like that, but please make sure that you clarify what is included in the base rent cost if it's a double net lease. That makes sense for everybody? And that's very, very uncommon. Okay, so now we're going to go into basic calculations of rent so everybody can kind of understand when a landlord says per square foot versus monthly versus annual. Okay, so these are the 3 main calculations. If you want to take a screenshot, I know that I think you guys get the deck after this anyway, so it'll be in the deck. But calculate your annual rent. You take your total square feet and you multiply it by your price per square foot. Now, please note your price per square foot on a triple net lease is your base rent, like I mentioned. I'll go back to it. Just your base rent, your triple net expenses, and your utilities. Typically, a landlord will have an estimate of the triple net leases that will help in your calculation when you're trying to determine your budget. If it's modified gross, then you could just do your base rent. Utilities are pretty much the exact same in this space. So they might have historical data on it from someone that is previously rented the space, but they may not. So again, your total square foot in this example, 2,500 square feet multiplied by $15 a square foot gets you your annual rent of $37,500. Now, please note, if they advertise a base rent of $15 a square foot, great, or whatever they advertise their base rent as, you take that, you multiply by the total square foot, and you get the annual rent. I run into a lot of folks that, especially that happens a lot if people move from other parts of the country, where they see the price per square foot and they think it's a monthly calculation. It is not. To find the monthly calculation, you take your annual rent, so this $37,500, and you divide it by 12 months, and that's your monthly rent. So in the state of Ohio, and you see a price per square foot, this is to calculate your annual rent. And then for your base rent, you basically just work backwards, right? So you take your monthly rent times 12 months. If you already have your annual rent, then you just put that number here, and you divide by the total square feet to get your base rent. I find this to be extremely important because some landlords will talk in price per square foot. Some landlords will talk in monthly rent. Very few actually talk in annual rent, but you need to know that number, well, for yourself for budgeting purposes, but also to be able to calculate monthly or price per square foot. I also think it's very important because when you're working on your personal budget for your company, you might be looking at an annual rent number or a monthly rent number. So it's very, very important to be able to plug in whatever you need into your own budgeting document. Any questions on these three calculations? Okay. So this is, I'm leaving the rest open. We're done about 12 minutes early, I believe, for questions. So I'm happy to go back to any slide, elaborate on anything that we chatted about, give more examples. You let me know. Oh, thank you so much. Landlords don't talk about this, and it's very unfortunate that landlords don't talk about this. And even as nice as landlords may seem, at the end of the day, they're going to go by the legal wording. They're going to go by anything in an email. By the way, if you go back and forth in an email, that can be legally binding. So please make sure that if you ever clarify anything like over the phone, that you also put it in writing. That's another thing that I should have mentioned. So please make sure that anything that you have is anytime in writing, whether it's actually in a document that's been sent back and forth or it's in an email.
Folks, you can put your questions in the Q&A or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you.
No question is too small, I promise you. It took me, who's in the industry, a while to figure out any and all these little details. So I welcome any question.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the monthly webinar Jumpstart, and thank you, the kind lady who's speaking. I'm the one who had the comment about the binding lease. So my thing was I should have gotten a real estate lawyer to look over the lease. There was some questionability at the beginning, but I trusted way too easy, and I had not been used to this commercial level.
Yep.
And life is like, actually you learn, but then you get taught after the lesson. So this is right on time for me. I just received a new some new funding, so I'll be going back into commercial business after being off for about 11 months. So this is, yeah, thank you. And so this is really great. I love this. But I have a question. This is the question. How can you, because when you're in a commercial space, now I'm an artist, I'm a visual artist, I make things. So all I do is exhibit art and other people's art, my own art. How do you do this? There's a lot of pressure. Sometimes the landlords, you got to sign it by this time. You've got to. So every lease you think we should have an attorney look it over?
If you've gotten to the lease stage, that typically means that there's just one building left. So I wouldn't recommend in your search having multiple leases out. So if you found a space and you're at the lease stage, that should be the only lease that you have to review. And I would say at least the last step before you sign it. So even if you've gone back and through it, like you yourself has found things that needed to be changed, the tenant typically signs first. So, I mean, and the landlords are always going to put pressure on you, right? And that's their tactic. So, I mean, you absolutely, unfortunately, have to tell yourself just to take a step back. And at the end of the day, the worst thing that could happen is you lose what seems to be a great space. But typically, if a landlord is pressuring you that much, there might be something else that's going on that he needs to get it for his own, lender, or you're the only person that he's had in a year or two, or she really wants you because she thinks that she can take advantage of somebody, something like that. So before you sign, even if it's only one time that an attorney looks it over, I would absolutely 100% recommend before you sign.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Claire, I don't know if you can see in the Q&A, we have one over there.
Okay, starting out, is it best to begin with a 1-year lease or to agree to a 3 or 5 year lease? Essentially, would there be incentives to sign a longer lease right at the beginning? Fantastic question. So I think it's two-part. One, I would say it's personal. So if you, let's say, are more of an established business and you can, you have things planned out 3 to 5 years in advance and it's helpful, absolutely. But yes, there is 100% incentives to sign a longer lease. So it could be a couple different things. They could offer you less, it would be less rent per month. So that base rent maybe goes from $15 per square foot to $14.50 per square foot. Your annual increases in rent, which usually takes an account for inflation, could decrease instead of 3% annual increases to 2.5% annual increases. They might offer you more tenant improvements. So for a year-long lease, they don't really see the need for them to invest any money in this space, because once you sign a lease, 6 months later, they're looking for another tenant if they don't think that you're going to stay. So they would offer to invest more money into the space. However, I would never put you guys into a situation where 3 to 5 years could be harmful for your business. If at any point in time, a length of time would be harmful for your business, or you might grow out of it in 3 to 5 years and all of a sudden you're stuck in this space, I would not recommend. So if you're confident in as long of a time as possible, absolutely go for it, because you will get more in the negotiations. Absolutely. Great question. Anything? These are fantastic questions. Even if there's case by cases that anyone wants to raise, I'm happy to advise on any of those. I do want to make sure you have my contact information, because if you don't feel comfortable saying it in front of others, please feel free to contact me. There's another question. Are tenant rates the same on the commercial side as the residential? Is there a housing court in the commercial side? Fantastic question. Not to the extent that there is on the residential side. The residential side has a fantastic housing court. And typically the tenant's rights always supersede the owner of an apartment building or a house. Yes, I would say that the residential side, it's an unbelievable amount of rights to the tenant that the commercial side does not have. Unfortunately, I also think too that on the commercial side, landlords typically own a whole bunch of properties in different locations, or they own a variety of sizes. So one tenant to them, though it shouldn't be like this, is not as important in their portfolio of things. So no, it is not the same on the commercial side as it is on the residential side. Great question. Yeah.
Any other questions? You can put it in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you.
Looking just to make, you've given the answer already. I was like, I think I've answered everything, but.
I think so. I think you answered every question. Oh, we have one.
There we go. Okay. When purchasing commercially, what are some tips? Great question. So that same process goes for purchasing commercially, except that last step of, I'll pull back up. Lease would be to buy. Sorry, I'll try to not click as fast so it doesn't give everyone a headache. Okay, so same thing. Determine your need for your proposal or letter of intent. same wording for purchasing commercially as leasing commercially, but this last step then would be purchase rather than lease. And I think the only differences really in terms of the determining the need is to absolutely ensure that this space that you're about to purchase, you can fully fund, either whether it's through yourself, grant money, mortgages, and I would establish all of your funding prior to. So when creating a budget, make sure that any and all funding that is required, whether to start your business or to buy and start your business or just to buy, is accounted for. I think a lot of people run into that when it's a great building and it looks fantastic and it would fit their needs, and then they start this whole process and then they realize that they're not going to get as much funding as they had hoped for, or it's going to take a lot longer and they shouldn't have really started this process until they knew the entirety of where their funding was coming from. I also think too that when you're researching, you need to really make sure that the building that you're looking into, that everything is accounted for, right? So if you walk into a space and you need to make a lot of changes to it, totally fine. But I would budget and price out all of those changes before, or at least during the process of putting a building under contract. When you put a building under contract, that is gives you enough time to do any of your due diligence work. So that would include, like I said, bringing out folks to price out things that need to be changed, and then really do your research. So make sure that you're getting any and all reports that they have on the building, so you know, walking into the building, you know, what may have ever been wrong with it. Maybe the roof, there was an issue with the roof 5 years ago and it was replaced. Make sure you have that information. So I would say that this step is, buying a commercial property, the most important step is your research before you put an offer into the building, and also after you put an offer into the building, making sure that you obtain all of the information that they have on the building. And if they don't have information, then bringing people out and investing in those folks to take a look at the building. So whether it be environmental, whether it be a contractor, unfortunately that is on the person buying the property to pay for most of the time. So that's another thing to keep in mind, but it's another step that I would not forego, bringing in those folks ahead of time, just so you know exactly what you're getting into. Okay, if we're doing a bank loan for purchase, is there a pre-qualification letter as on a residential side? And if yes, how long does it last? What are typical loan terms time for commercial mortgages? Yes, there is a pre-qualification letter. We're working right now with a cafe who's opening about 3,000 square feet. And she has before, and now in this case, it's a lease, but she's getting a loan to fully start the cafe. And she has met with the bank a couple of times. She's brought in all of her research. So how much money it's going to be to update things within the current cafe space. And she's presented it to her bank. They've helped work out a loan. The loan term depends on the lease, or if you're purchasing a building. So if you're signing a lease for, let's say, 10 years, they'll typically give you the loan for 10 years or longer, but they take the lease term, and that is what is added into the, or how long mortgage term that you would be receiving. And yes, there's a pre-qualification letter, and then that is also given to the owner of the building. So the person that is the landlord that is leasing the space out to this cafe requires that pre-qualification letter, just to, so he knows that there is funding that's available, and he also knows, you know, how long the mortgage lasts, how much it is. So he's also has full confidence in this cafe space. Okay, please comment on starting up a group home. I've heard many Cleveland Ward Council persons are not supportive starting for this kind of business. Yes, unfortunately, the city of Cleveland, there are some things that they're not as supportive of. Whether that's right or wrong, you are totally right. Will you elaborate on, I have a couple group homes that I've actually worked with in the past. Will you elaborate on what type of group home? And while you're typing, I'm happy to kind of comment on that. So that's another thing in the research part of it, that you need to make sure that you're going into an area where the zoning, it's proper zoning, or you know that you have full support to rezone that area. I would not go into an area that is either not properly zoned or does not have full support, because and I certainly wouldn't sign a lease or buy a building before going into that, because then you're legally bound and you're not able to even do it. So that would be in terms of the determined need, the research, the specific items necessary for your space. That would include zoning. Transition from incarceration, young mothers, disabled vets. Yep, exactly. Okay, so in this case, we have worked with someone similar for this, and that was the first thing that we told them, was to make sure that A, is zoned properly, or B, you have the full support and you start going through the rezoning process in congruence with your lease. So unfortunately, the city of Cleveland, or any city, if they're not going to be willing to rezone, you're kind of out of luck in that area. So I would recommend, whether it's the right or wrong answer, to look in other areas. I don't necessarily agree with the fact that they wouldn't be helpful to rezoning areas, but at the end of the day, a change in zoning could take months, if not years, and most likely you don't have that kind of time to wait to see if they do go through rezoning. And rezoning isn't just a simple one-time meeting. There's drawings that go into it. There's proof of concept. There is meetings with council people. So it's a lot longer process than just changing the zoning. What other types of businesses does the city not look favorably upon when it comes to commercial space? That's a good question. I'm assuming you mean the city of Cleveland as opposed to surrounding cities. It depends on the area. So I know the city of Cleveland has a full commercial plan for downtown and surrounding neighborhoods. And it's different on the west and the east side. So there are a lot of areas where they are focusing, let's say, on women-owned business or minority-owned businesses. For example, Midtown. I do a ton in Midtown. That's where Jumpstart is. And there's a huge push for minority-owned businesses. And we're under contract on a building for a group that is a minority-owned accounting firm. And then they're also starting an incubation site for other places. Fantastic. We're super excited. That was really, really easy, even though it's not currently zoned for everything that they wanted to do. The city of Cleveland was very, very helpful, because that is one of their goals. So it's online, it's public information, their city plan, and also what area is zoned in what capacity, right? So downtown, you're more commercial space, a lot of retail. So I would strongly recommend just Googling the city of Cleveland's economic growth plan and see what they kind of have in mind, because something specific, like a group home, might be better in one place of Cleveland in terms of having to rezone than others. It just really depends on the area, though, Michelle, for your comment. Anything else? These are all fantastic questions. They're wonderful.
Any others? Wow, Claire, sometimes we have webinars and absolutely no questions get asked. So you really earned your keep today.
Absolutely. That's what I'm here for. I'll go to the content.
Yeah, appreciate it. And our attendees got a math lesson, which I don't know that any of them bargained for. So thanks very much for that.
Absolutely.
So Claire's being kind enough to give her contact information if you have any follow-up questions on this font of wisdom and information that we received today. Coming up in the future, we have lots more webinars. The next one is Harnessing Mobile Apps for Business Success. That one is on February 21st, and you can review our webinars and other events at jumpstartinc.org/events. As I said at the beginning, at the end of today's session and in a follow-up email, you'll receive a brief survey. We all have survey fatigue. We really, really appreciate the time you take to give us that feedback so that we can bring in experts like Claire to talk to you about this important stuff. We will also be sending you the slides and the YouTube link next week. That's all we have today. Thank you so much, Claire Coyne, for coming and representing Newmark and talking to us. And I learned a lot myself. I'm sure everyone did. And thank you all for coming today, and we'll see you next time.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.